Another interesting way to consider the effects of a loose connector is by looking at the insertion loss and the return loss while the connector is being loosened. I have here a standard network analyzer. I'm currently looking between 5 megahertz and 60 megahertz. So I'm looking at the entire return path, and I'm also picking up a little bit of the forward path. And what we see here is that as I loosen a connector, this is an industry standard connector, we immediately see unstable return loss, and depending on how this thing is sitting behind somebody's television or behind somebody's modem, we've got return loss of 0 dB or near 0 dB. I imagine that would have dramatic effects on packet loss. We also see the insertion loss reaching levels of negative 20 dB. That's just one of the connectors in the industry. Another connector in the industry, again, I'll just loosen it a couple of turns, and we immediately see unstable return loss, and we can see single-digit return loss at times, especially down in the low end of the return path. Insertion loss is reaching as high as 5 dB in this case. I'm going to skip over the signal tight connector for now, go to the standard EX connector. If I loosen that a couple turns, again, we can immediately see an unstable return loss. And in the discontinuity position, it reaches return loss values of around 0 dB with insertion loss values we can see reaching over or greater than 20 dB. And then we've got a couple of other connectors here. I loosen them up a little bit. We see that the return loss gets unstable. Reaching as high as, again, 0 dB when it reaches that discontinuity state. And the last industry connector I've got, well, this one's jumping right up to near 0 dB return loss and about 17, 18, 20 dB of insertion loss. So I'm going to tighten these guys all back up. And I loosen only the signal tight connector. I loosen it a couple of turns, and immediately we see no change. It's perfectly stable. Let's really loosen this up. In fact, I've turned that off several turns. And I'm wiggling, and I'm pushing, and I'm pulling. And what we see is that I can't muck up the signal. I can't find any place where we get a poor return loss or a poor insertion loss. Let me run through these connectors again. Okay, everybody's tight. We can see that because I can wiggle the entire assembly and it's all stable. But if I loosen up one connector, right here at this end, just a couple of turns, it's just cracked loose, and immediately we see unstable return loss and insertion loss values exceeding 20 dB, depending on just how the connector is sitting. Another connector, as soon as I loosen it up, we get very unstable. Return loss measurements in the single digits. Even the PPC EX connector, when it's loose, can be sitting there at 0 dB return loss and over 20 dB insertion loss. Another industry connector. Again, we've got return loss values, intermittency all over the place, but return loss values at times at 0 dB and insertion loss exceeding 20 dB. And the last industry connector immediately goes to about a 1 dB return loss and 17, 18 dB insertion loss. So we tighten these back up, and now we go to the PPC signal tight connector, and I loosen it a little bit. I wiggle, I push, I pull. No matter what I do, I can't muck that one up. Really loosen it up. even that loose, I've still got good solid return loss and good solid insertion loss. Not until I completely disconnect it do my signals go bad. As long as I've got a thread on here, I've got stable return loss and stable insertion loss.